Remember that you can't miss what is meant for you. And even if you have to set boundaries and leave behind someone who you loved or something that you loved and you're scared and you don't want to leave it behind, but you know that it's not living up to the standard you want to set for yourself as a man or for what's next for you in the future, just remember you cannot miss what is meant for you. And as you step into the next chapter, if it's not there for you anymore, something better is waiting for you.
Welcome to the UnScripted Authentic Leadership Podcast, a podcast where we're seeking to lead change while also seeking to understand. We're also here as a platform for leaders to come together to unite, to develop, and empower other leaders in the areas of business, family, and community. I'm your host, Lafayette Lane, joined by my co-host, John LeBron. Tonight, we are joined by our special guest, Elise Micheals, who is a men's mental health coach. She's also one who understands how trauma impacts men. And tonight, she's joined us right here on the UnScripted Authentic Leadership Podcast. Elise, thanks for coming on.
Thank you guys so much. I'm super excited to be here.
Super excited to have you and super excited about this conversation. John and I both, we have done a series before on mental health, and it's something that we understand the severity and the importance of it, especially in the time that we are living in, and particularly interested in what you do, that you hone in specifically on men's mental health. I want to start with, how did you get into the mental health space and specifically in helping men?
Absolutely. Well, I got into the mental health space because I had my own problems. I really never wanted to be a coach. I just said, oh my God, I can't keep repeating the same patterns. So I enlisted a therapist. And after a year and a half, I felt that I still didn't have all of the answers. I felt like it made me feel better, but it wasn't quite solved. So that's when I dove into my own neuroscience classes, trauma therapy, relationship science, I already said neuroscience, but REBT, CBT, like anything you could possibly think of, I'm certified in. And once I found out how to heal my own trauma, I just said, oh my God, I have to help people out with this so that they can save time where I didn't.
So I noticed I saw a post from you a while back, and it could have been some time ago. And you had mentioned, you kind of talked about how you got into men's mental health, because often what you see is ladies supporting ladies in coaching, men supporting men, because maybe we just feel like we can relate to that. I don't know. How did you get into specifically men's mental health instead of universal mental health or women's, that kind of thing?
I got into men's mental health specifically because when I started my business, I posted video content on LinkedIn, and I actually was trying to be a woman's coach, but only men reached out to me for help. And I thought it was super weird. I was like, I don't know how to help you. In my mind, I said this, right? But then I said, let me get on a few calls with them. Let me see if what I can do, because I can help people through pain. So let's just try it. And then I noticed that they just didn't have as much support as women. It seems like there's a woman's coach for everything. But as far as men and mental health goes, it was far and few between when I started this business 3 years ago. Now it's kind of like a trend. But when I started, it was unheard of. So I just decided to be that person.
Absolutely. I think that's so good, because there's not a lot of, I know, like you said, I agree, it is a trend now, but I still feel, especially as a Black man, there's not a lot of safe spaces for us to go as men in general, to be safe and to be vulnerable without, showing our Clark Kent side, if I could put it that way.
Well, and even the men's coaches that I see now, which really irks me. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're fine.
You brought up such a good point, is even the men's coaches that I see, a lot of them, because of this whole feminist movement or the masculine versus feminine thing that's going on, they're going back into the old mentality of, you shouldn't show your emotions, you're a pussy, men are not men anymore, right? So now even in this trend, it's mental health support, but also not mental health support, because you got the Andrew Tates, and it's just so it's just as men were starting to become safe, now it's oh my God, you're not a man anymore.
Right. And it's a fully loaded thing, that I can still be a man and still have my emotions and still have my emotional competence and still have emotional intelligence and all of these things. And it doesn't take away from me being a man. As a matter of fact, it adds to my manhood to make me be a better father, a better husband, a better businessman, a better all-around man, just in general. But I want to really put some definition to what you do, because we're talking about the trauma piece. How would you define trauma? Because you talk about understanding, helping men how to understand trauma to better themselves. What is trauma?
Trauma is actually the psychological impact of an event, not the event itself. So when we talk about trauma, it could just be any number of things, because everybody has different experiences, perspectives, upbringings. Like you talked about yourself being a Black man, you're going to have a way different experience for a specific event than a white man would, or an Asian man would, or a Mexican man would, because of your societal expectations, because of the things that you endure, right? So trauma can impact people different ways. So it's the psychological impact of an event, which is why I put different videos about if you have a mother wound or father wound, or if you have these behaviors, because really it's hard to pinpoint what trauma we have unless we study the behaviors that we're exhibiting in our lives. So studying the behaviors can help us understand the particular trauma that's impacting us.
Wow. So how do you, as a coach, differentiate or put yourself into the shoes of that person to understand their perspectives? Because I'm always really interested personally in understanding other people's perspectives. It's been a journey I've been on for about 2 or 3 years, is instead of taking my view of the world and putting it on, let's say, Lafayette and how he sees something. Instead, it's like, okay, how do I get into literally his perspective and see it the same so I have a better understanding? As you noticed, he said at the beginning of the podcast, seeking to understand. So how do you put yourself in that spot? I would imagine that would be something you need to do to help sort of, I don't like to use the word diagnose, but, take some steps forward.
Right. And you point out something very good is I can never be in the spot of them.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have to remain in the spot of coach, because if I'm in the spot of them, I will never be able to help them. Right. Because then I see how they see, and I need to see what they don't see. But in order to understand how they are seeing, I just have to be extremely curious and ask questions. Right. My job is mostly asking questions to get answers, as opposed to just listening a bit and then kind of deciding from there. But it really is important not to take on the perspective of my clients, because if they could have solved it the way that they're seeing it, they would have.
So it's about how you see it then. Because you talked about that the definition of trauma is not necessarily the event itself, but the psychological impact, the perception, the imagery that's now in the mind, that's now playing out in the reality. I think that's so good. I want to ask a question, because you talked about trends earlier. One of the trends I see from a lot of coaches on social media a lot that deal with men and men's health and relationships is this term high value man or high value men. And I'm seeing a lot of different definitions on what men think that is, or what women think that is, or what a high value man is. Some of it's a positive image, and some of it's a negative thing. As a mental health coach, do you think that putting this emphasis on being high value, do you think, number one, is that good? And number two, how would you define that?
It's so funny because I just made a post, I think yesterday, called traits of a high value man.
Okay.
I jumped on the trend. Because it is so different for everybody, right? And I was seeing posts where high value men are equated to high earning men, right? Men who just are solely providers and they make a lot of money. And where we've gotten lost in this is then we ignore everything else. We don't understand our core values or our boundaries, or how to relate to our spouse, or how to, get through conflict, right? So when I put traits of a high value man, I kind of made that distinction. And a high value man isn't a singular, like, this is what you look like as a high value man, as much as it is, do you understand these things about yourself so that you can become a high value man of yourself? And I think that everybody should work towards being a high value woman and a high value man, because if you're not working on yourself, what are you doing? To be totally honest, and that might be my personal opinion, not coming from the mental health coach side, but everybody should be working on themselves to become high value.
When we talk about mental health, I know there's a lot of conversation about let's say, medications versus not. And I'm not saying you have to say whether they're good or bad or not. I don't know. I'm sure you have your opinion on it and you can totally give it. But I also know sometimes people kind of are careful in that conversation. But I can't help but think that a lot of mental health must stem a little bit from, you said high value, but I would say, and then you mentioned personal development. It just seems to me that there's a correlation between, I know people who are, I would say, always pursuing and I don't want to say building themselves up, but developing themselves personally in a healthy way, and those who are not, and that people who seem to move down that road of becoming better and seeing themselves better, maybe self-valuing themselves better, seem to have less of the depression issue. Therefore, it really makes me wonder, is depression really a chemical imbalance? Or because if it was, then wouldn't the medication cure the depression? Versus, I've never met anybody who's on depression meds. Maybe I have, I don't know. But most who are on depression meds remain on it for a lifetime, and they're still depressed. I might have opened up a can of worms. I don't know.
No, I mean, well, I'm not like a licensed therapist or psychologist, so I guess none of us can really speak on this in a scientific way, but
That's okay.
I've listened to Gary Brecka, who worked in health insurance and the medicine side for 20 years. I'm not sure if he's a valid expert to reference either, but him and the holistic psychologist, who might be more of a valid reference. And she has actually mentioned that studies have come out recently where it's been proven false about the chemical imbalance in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Regardless or not, if people are low, they're going to need more tools to help them, right? Like the deeper in a hole you are, the more help you're going to need to get out of that hole. But when it comes to preventing ourselves from getting in the hole, right, and getting out of the hole, you can't just, like if someone throws you down a rope to get you out of the hole, right? Like let's say that's the medicine, you still have to climb the rope, right? Or you're not going to get out of the hole. Like just having the tool itself is not going to help you. But keep in mind, even if it is a chemical imbalance, sorry if I'm going like all over the place.
No, you're good.
This is just what I've thought about. If it is a chemical imbalance, your brain itself gives you the chemicals every day, right? Like it changes depending on the exercise you're doing, the food you're eating, the thoughts that you're thinking, the people you're surrounded by, the stuff that you're taking in via podcasts, books. So in a sense, you determine what chemicals your body produces anyway. So if there's an imbalance, how can we balance that out in a way that, we haven't been? So like you said, if we haven't been doing the self-development work, if we're not in a good environment, it's reasonable that you would be depressed. Mm-hmm. And so why not address those things in your life so that you are not depressed, as opposed to, and that might sound like so easy, right? I don't want anybody listening to this to get offended, but people will just give us pills as like a cure, right? They say, oh, you're depressed, take this medicine, instead of being like, oh, you're in a crappy marriage, like, you need to get out of that. Oh, you're in an abusive relationship, or you're in a job that you freaking hate. Like, people aren't addressing the soul issues, so they're remaining depressed for the rest of their lives. Of course, the medicine's not going to help you. You're in a relationship 100%. You hate.
Dealing with
I don't know what you guys
root
think.
of the problem is what you're saying.
Right.
Go ahead, bro.
Yeah, I feel like the medication, I'm not saying someone can't use it. I'm just saying it shouldn't be there to stay. Like if someone needs that, so they literally don't commit suicide tomorrow, and they can start the personal process to get better, God bless you, go for it. But should that be there 8 years later? I mean,
well, I think our system trains people to use it as this is what's keeping you from suicide, as opposed to, hey, we're going to get you on this to get you out of these dark thoughts, to get you on the right path. And then we're going to wean you off to see, since you've changed these things in your life, to see how well you fare without it. Right. But a lot of times we're not training people to do that. We're training people to say, hey, you need this forever. So there's a chemical imbalance in your brain. There's something wrong with you. They tell people that something's wrong with them.
Sure.
When you're working with somebody, I'm assuming there's some kind of development plan then to help them sort of move forward and have a strong mental health. Like what kind of things does that typically look like?
Absolutely. After every session that I have with someone, they have an action item so that they have something to work on throughout the week. They have unlimited WhatsApp support from me so that if they have an idea or a question or something that comes up, we can address it in the moment. so that they help rewire the neural pathways. And action items that it might look like are, rededicating time to self. A lot of times what depresses us is not so much all the things that we're doing, it's all the things that we're not doing, right? Not taking care of ourselves, not doing things we enjoy. Like we don't spend time with friends. We don't even have friends anymore at a certain point, right? So it's kind of like, how can I incorporate more joy into my life? How can I incorporate more self-care into my life? How can I slow down some more? How can I start having date nights with my partner again? How can I start having sex with my partner again, right? All of these other things that we just kind of stopped doing because we thought that that's just what happens.
You made a interesting post, and I definitely want to dig into it. You said our addictions are not the problems; they are the solutions. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so anytime that we're struggling, we're looking for a way to feel better. So when we go to things like alcohol or porn or sex or, sugar, that's not like we find that out. We're like, oh my God, I'm addicted to alcohol. I'm addicted to working. I'm addicted to porn. When that's not actually the problem. That's not the reason why you're there. That is the solution that you found to feel better. And so what happens is we end up treating that thing and we become addicted to something else because we haven't found the way to calm our nervous system. We haven't found a way to look at the problems in our lives. And it just goes into something else and something else and something else.
That is extremely deep and very profound of what you just said. So the addiction is not the problem. The addiction is actually the solution. Go ahead, bro.
I think this came a little more talked about during COVID and people are locked up or concerned about the news and stuff. How much do the outside influences impact or affect our mental health?
I mean, outside influences always impact our mental health, but what COVID really did was it isolated us. And isolation is, if you think about it, in prison, it's the worst punishment that you can give to a human being, right? You put them in the isolation container. So when you isolate the entire world, of course, it almost doesn't matter what's going on in the outside world, like they are isolated. And so anytime someone is in isolation, the impact of whatever's going on is going to be 100-fold, right? Because they feel so alone.
Yeah. And so when somebody's sort of feeling depressed, our natural, I would say, tendencies is to self-isolate. Would you find that? Therefore,
yes, and it makes it worse.
I was just thinking that with the COVID conversation, because you get isolated and then you feel depressed and then you stay home even more, even though you're free to go, and they feel even worse. So how do you dig out of that? But is this solution literally just, hey, get out of the house and go see the birds? I don't know.
Well, and this is where, we always talk about what we do when we're at the bottom, but I really think it's important to have conversations about what we do in our lives before we get to the bottom. Like, what are you doing in your life to nurture yourself before you hit rock bottom? Are you having a good friends and family support system? Are you nurturing those relationships? Because then when you get to the bottom, if you are isolating, you have people to reach out to who can be like, hey, I see you're stuck inside. You're listening to sad music. You're eating out of 3-day-old pizza boxes. Like, we need to go. We need to go to the gym. We need to go on the boat. You know what I mean? So when someone is isolated like that, sometimes their only option is going to the doctor and getting medication. That, like, you need to do what you need to do to just get out, to create movement, to create momentum.
We live in a society where pleasing seems to be the norm, especially with social media. It can be easy to fall into that trap of trying to please people or please a certain crowd to get a certain response. U.S. said specifically talking to men, but it applies to everyone, that men who try to please everyone eventually becomes victims of their own generosity. That's a whole lot. So can you unpack that? How can we become victims? How do we become victims of our own generosity?
You tell me what you think. How do you think a man can become a victim of his own generosity?
Go ahead, bro.
I think there's a few things. One, the inability to say no. So then you get too flooded. Also, sometimes we have a tendency to give and then have expectations in return. Not that they have to give you something back, but even it's like if you do the dishes at home and no one says thank you, and you're like, does anybody see that I did the dishes? And you don't really say that, but you kind of do it. Or
Yeah.
like maybe you're doing it a little extra. I joke with my wife, like, well, each of us have done this where like you put the plates in a little bit extra hard that day because you're like, I'm doing the dishes. I hope everybody hears these clinging, And I don't know. That's what comes to mind.
Yeah. I think for me, I think that's good what you said, bro. Just to add on to that, people can perceive you as being a pushover. Oh, he's just a nice guy, and so we can say anything, we can do anything to him when in all actuality, that's just not what it is. Just because I'm nice doesn't mean I'm a pushover.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. You guys totally nailed it. And the thing is, sometimes, like in combination with what both of you said, we can be so nice that we subconsciously create a contract with someone where we want them to do something for us. And we're afraid to actually say what we want. So it actually makes a man passive aggressive because he's not actually saying what he really wants. And he wants them to see the worth and value. So he's like, oh, like someone breaks up with him, for example. He's like, oh, well, I hope if somebody ever loves you as much as I did, or, gives you the flowers like I did, or cares about your special animals like I did, that you can love them the way you never loved me, right? Like, it's so passive aggressive and it just makes you look bad. And like, you're trying to communicate like, hey, you freaking hurt me and I'm upset that you didn't love me back. But what you're really doing is making yourself sound mean and like, why don't you love me the way I need to be loved, right? So just by being too, I think I kind of got off track here, but you can become a victim of your own generosity by
No.
overgiving and not stating your boundaries or needs.
That's really powerful because I coach men as well. I coach dads, right? And recently, one of the dads told me he expressed a little bit of frustration with doing something, but he didn't really want to do for somebody. And it was like almost frustration towards them. And I try to nicely let him know that, hey, your inability to say no is actually more of a reflection of you having a sort of low self-image in this area. He's like, what do you mean? I said, well, when you can't tell someone no, it's because you're afraid to say no to things, and it actually hurts you guys that you wouldn't tell them no. I said, because now you're going to do something that you didn't want to do for someone you didn't want to do it for, and you're not doing it now with a generous sort of spirit. And the entire time you're doing it, you're like, I hope I get something back for this, or I don't know why I'm doing this, or I'm too busy for this. I can't believe I'm the one that has to put up with all of those things. And so I said, so actually, it's more your fault for not just saying, hey, I don't have a good excuse. I just can't do this right now. I don't need a good excuse. I don't have to make up a story. Just, hey, this can't be my priority in this moment. I appreciate you, but maybe find somebody else.
I think it's tough too because we're talking about generosity and saying no, and that's so good what you said, bro. So good what you said, Elise. But it's also the other side of, well, I'm not the generosity part, but I struggle with actually opening up and being vulnerable. So what do you say to the men that come to you and say, hey, it's not that I'm struggling with being too nice or being too generous. I don't know how to effectively be vulnerable enough to, whether that's communicating your feelings or telling someone how you feel, open up and have the emotional competence. What do you say to those men that come to you and say, hey, how do I become more vulnerable?
Yeah, and that's really tough because usually if you have trouble being vulnerable, it's because you haven't felt like you could really trust anyone, or you felt like you've been punished for expressing your needs, expressing yourself. So usually men struggle with being vulnerable because they actually don't even know what they're feeling. They don't know how to communicate it. And so the first steps that I always tell them is like, we have to get to understand ourselves so that we can actually learn how to communicate it to someone. And that it's just taken step by step because we have to learn what we're feeling and how we're feeling. Then we have to find someone safe to communicate it to, right? Someone we can trust, because sometimes not everybody's safe. Our friends, our family, sometimes they don't have the tools. Sometimes they're the most judgmental people in our lives. And we try to share something with them and they're the ones who like backfire on us, right? And then you don't ever want to share again. So you have to find someone safe. And then you have to learn how to communicate it in a healthy way. And it takes practice, because sometimes even the people we love, even the people who are healthy and safe, can still hurt us, can still respond in a way that's unfavorable, right? But if you've already got like a therapist or a coach, that's a person who you can trust, right? They have the tools for you to try those things at first and to get an example of, oh, this is what a healthy response looks like, right? So that could be a good first step. Or the steps that I just said, understanding yourself, what you need, understanding who's a safe person, and then understanding how to communicate those needs to them. And as you do that, it gets easier and easier, because it's not as scary anymore. It's not as daunting. It's just a regular conversation.
That's so good. Doesn't vulnerability sometimes feel like a muscle you have to work on? I feel like it's kind of like empathy, meaning when you first, even being empathetic is sort of vulnerable. Like if I send someone a text saying, hey, Lafayette, I just want you to know, bro, that I really appreciate you, appreciate your brotherhood, all those things. That's sort of being a little bit vulnerable and less, I guess, masculine in the world's eyes, which is something I would say to him. That's why I said it. And I remember early on when people would say, hey, send a message to 5 people and let them know how much you appreciate them. And girls would be like in the conference, yeah, all my girls. And then guys are like, I don't know, maybe I'll send it to my mom, right? And you really look, and then eventually though, if you practice those types of things, it becomes easier. It becomes easier to become more vulnerable. It's easier to show appreciation and not just like, they know we're friends. They know I appreciate them. And sort of step into that, I guess, feeling and just appreciation. I feel like I don't know. Is it, maybe you know better than I do.
I mean, I would totally agree. I think everything is kind of a muscle that you have to work the first time that you do it, right? And it gets easier the more positive reinforcement you get back. That's why I said you have to find a safe space. And the more positive reinforcement you get back, the more you can branch out. But especially this is hard for men, because men feel like their guy friends will judge them for it. When most men that I've talked to want to be vulnerable, they think these things. They think, oh man, I like really appreciate my friend, or I really want someone to talk to. And they're like, I don't really have any guys like that. They're not like that. Okay, well, I want you to remember that most every man is putting on a front when it comes to that. Because every man is a human, and humans have emotions. Humans want to be vulnerable. Humans need to connect. So if you can be brave and be the first one to kind of venture out and be vulnerable with one of your guy friends, I think it unlocks the door to so much connection.
Powerful, powerful. Elise, we always wrap up our last segment and we call it off script. Give us an off script moment where we ask our guests just to give us whatever's on their heart that they want to leave with our audience. Give us your off script moment.
I just want to say thank you guys so much for inviting me on. And you opened with a prayer, and I really appreciate that. And what's on my heart, just from the sessions I've been having recently and from men who have asked me questions, is remember that you can't miss what is meant for you. And even if you have to set boundaries and leave behind someone who you loved or something that you loved, and you're scared and you don't want to leave it behind, but you know that it's not living up to the standard you want to set for yourself as a man or for what's next for you in the future, just remember you cannot miss what is meant for you. And as you step into the next chapter, if it's not there for you anymore, something better is waiting for you. And just trust in that.
Yep. That's how you do the off-script moment. Listen, we want you to follow Elise on Instagram, and you can do so at Elise Micheals _. You will see that right there on the screen. Follow her on Instagram at Elise Micheals, ELISEMICHEALS _. On Instagram. Follow her. She's got amazing content that will help you on your journey, help you through your day. And again, we're talking about men, but what she's giving is applicable to all walks of life, whether that you be a man or a woman. It will help you in every area. Stay connected here with us on Unscripted. You can follow us on all social media platforms at Unscripted Leadership. Excuse my voice. Unscripted-leadership.com. Our podcast is available on all audio streaming platforms. And of course, you can support us down on patreon.com/Unscripted Leadership. We thank you again, Elise, for having this amazing conversation with us. As always, we're here to build bridges and not walls. Bridges connect and walls divide. Until next time, we pray that you be the leader that God has called you to be. God bless.